Shapeshifter, submitted by Old Troll. Back in the late 70s in Worcester, UK, I was living in my family home, as was my sister, Dee. My sister and I discussed the paranormal, and both were very open-minded on that subject. At least I thought I was. Until late one night when she came home from seeing her boyfriend with a rather far-fetched story to tell. This is Dee's story. Dee and Jay, her boyfriend, were parked up in a lane down the road from our house. It ran alongside a canal separated by trees and bushes, and it was dark, of course, but lit slightly from a nearby motorway bridge. Dee told me that there was a sudden jolt from under the car, quite a strong jolt, causing the car to wobble. Jay looked out of his driver's side window and told Dee to look too. A black shape slowly seemed to ooze out, like a shadow onto the tarmac road. The shape stayed low as it moved into the road. It was jet black and now appeared to have a tail lifting up. Its body began to rise up as it moved away from the car, and Dee said it looked to be about the size of a Great Dane, yet moved like a cat slinking. Dee pointed out that they both agreed later that it was in fact way too big to have been able to fit under the car in the first place. This black thing walked slowly on all fours into the middle of the road, a couple of feet from them. They were too scared to put on the lights or do anything to get its attention. Suddenly, Dee said, all in one motion, it stood up on its back legs, and as it did that, it morphed into a man. A man in his middle age, with shoulder-length hair, a hat she described as maybe a trilby, and a long trench-style coat. Jay started the engine and put on the lights in a panic, and as he did, the man in the road walked calmly towards the car, waving his hands as though to signal that they shouldn't be scared. He walked right up to the windscreen as they shot off. They drove fast up the motorway roundabout, where usually there was always a police car around. They were sure they had clipped the man with the car as they sped off, and wanted to report the whole thing. Dee said that they were so shook up, it didn't occur to them how random the story sounded. Sod's law, no police car. Dee and Jay hung around on the well-lit roundabout for a while, but there was no one around, so they had to choose a way home. Always back to home meant traveling dark lanes again, and eventually they chose one and got home. Now I listened, heard her out, and sort of pretended to believe her, just humoring her. I actually thought it was the most bubble-headed rubbish she had ever come out with. Let's jump to 2004. I was working for MenCap. It was a little residential home in Worcester. Most of the staff there were into the paranormal, and a few of us joined an interest group based on ghosts at a local pub, and we met up once a fortnight. These meetings always meant that type of conversation bantered around at work the next day, too. The day after one meeting, I was in the kitchen at work with a lady I'll call Kay, who was talking about daft ghost stories, the type no one would ever believe. I offered up the story my sister told me all those years ago, and I explained how I found it so far out that I never forgot it. As I told the story about the man, dog, Black Panther, whatever, Elle, another staff member, was coming in and out of the kitchen, getting her things together to go home, as we had all finished our shift. Elle was of course hearing bits of what I was saying, and came back in and looked at us and asked, "How did you know about that?" I explained that this was years ago and not true. And I thought maybe Elle had heard the part about it moving like a big black cat, and presumed it was about the black cat sightings we heard so much about in the UK, and maybe about a possible wild cat roaming loose. I explained this was a different story, and it was about 20 years before she was even born. Elle said, "No, it was 6 months ago. It wasn't a cat or a dog. It was a man. Whatever it was turned into a man. Whoa. I was stunned. I asked Elle all about it, and she explained that her boyfriend and friends were parked in a country road in Hereford in daylight. They were smoking joints and chilling, and the car jolted. A large creature crawled out and walked into the road, stood up, and was in fact a man in a long coat, shoulder-length hair and wearing what they called a cowboy-type hat. It moved towards the car, waving a gesture to them to let it approach, but they sped off. They agreed never to talk about it to anyone, and naturally Elle's partner confided in her. When I got home from work, I phoned my sister. I had an apology to make for not believing her, and I knew she would want to know Elle's story. My sister and I were amazed at the time lapse between each sighting, yet the man looked the same. As we chatted about this, my then young daughter came downstairs, so I mumbled to my sister that we needed to change the conversation. My daughter called out as she passed me, "It's okay, I know what you're talking about." I laughed and said, "Oh yeah? What then?" My daughter said, "You're on about that stupid story. The man at the camp we went to who was trying to scare us the night that we went on that trek." My daughter had been away with the school a few weeks previous, to a camp in Malvern. My daughter told me there was a man who was about 21, said that there was a big black animal on the hills at night that might be a bear that turned into a man. I have a very open mind to everything now. My lesson is learned. The Prankster and His Keeper by Jennifer F. It was finals week in December of 1996 when I received a phone call from a friend of mine. She was going out of town and needed a house sitter for the week, and I jumped at the chance. I was still living at home, and a week of quiet study was just what I needed. She lived nearby, so if I had to go home it would be no problem. I went to see her a few days before she left to get acquainted with the house and her dog. She lived in an older neighborhood, and built maybe in the late 30s, and it was near the Ohio River. It was quaint and quiet, and she showed me around and gave me my instructions for the week, ending with some comment about lighting candles if the ghosts bothered me. I just smiled at that, since I didn't believe in any such phenomena. She was kind of weird anyway. A few days later, I returned to the house for my week's stay. The first few days in the house were relatively uneventful. In hindsight, I can say that there were a few areas of the house that I did not feel comfortable in, and I avoided them my entire stay, although I didn't think too much of it at the time. My boyfriend at the time stayed there with me the first few nights, and all was quiet in the house. On the third night, however, he informed me that he would not be able to stay the next night. And I was kind of relieved, since I had a paper to write and couldn't get anything done with him there. Nothing more was said, and the next morning I left for my classes at the university as usual, secure in the knowledge that I would have a long night of research and paper writing ahead of me. Little did I know that that night would be one of the longest I'd ever spent. I returned to the house at 4 o'clock and immediately picked up the phone to call home. The phone was dead. I quickly made a check of all the phone connections in the house, thinking maybe the dog had knocked a phone off the hook. No such luck. I made a mental note to call my friend from my house to see if she forgot to pay her bill. Then I sat down at her computer to write my paper. Hours passed, and I soon realized that it was approaching midnight. My paper was nearly complete, so I decided to call it a night, and I checked the phone again. No dial tone. I made a pallet on the floor of the den and laid down to go to sleep, and the dog soon joined me, curling up close. The fire was dying in the fireplace, and there was a nice soft glow. It was warm and comforting on that cold winter night in the Ohio Valley. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard the basement door open, and then softly close. I opened my eyes to see if the dog had heard it too. She was a big Chesapeake Bay Retriever, and I figured that if something was wrong, she would make me aware of it very quickly. She was totally asleep. So I resigned myself to hearing house creaks and closed my eyes again. A minute or two passed, and I heard what sounded distinctly like a man urinating in the bathroom upstairs. then the sound of running water in the bathroom sink, and no toilet flush. I was wide awake now, knowing that the sounds I heard were not house creaks, and I was wondering if my mind could fabricate sounds that were so realistic. You have to understand that I didn't believe in such things as ghosts, so these sounds were truly shocking. My mind was swirling, and either someone had broken into the house to take a leak, or there was something else much more supernatural going on here. A few moments passed, and I heard the intruder walking down the upstairs hallway towards the stairs. I glanced at the dog, thinking that surely she was hearing this too, but she was sound asleep. I was terrified and tried to talk to myself with a purely rational scientific mind. I am a biologist. If the dog was still asleep, then I must be hearing things. Too much stress in my life? Food poisoning? Overactive imagination? It took the next event to kill all of these thoughts and rattle my rational mind. I didn't hear anyone come down the stairs, so I tried to go to sleep, although I knew this effort was in vain. A few more minutes passed, and suddenly I heard a whisper coming from above my head. It was unintelligible, but it lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds. I was frozen. It took a great deal of effort to open one eye, and when I did, I saw that the dog was sitting up and looking in the direction of the whispering. I bolted upright and said, "Enough!" glancing around wildly and seeing nothing. I quickly turned on the lights, all of the lights, and made a search of the house. Of course I found nothing. All of the doors and windows were locked, and there was nobody, or nobody that I could see, that is, there but me and the dog. I checked the phone again. Dead. Satisfied that nobody else was there, I lit a candle and laid back down on the pallet. I guess I thought I was going to get some sleep, and I went through the motions anyway. I don't know how much time passed, but I had not fallen asleep yet when I felt a touch on my shoulder. It was neither hard nor soft, but rather a good poke, like someone had taken a finger and poked you in the arm. I was once again frozen. Then I felt another poke on my hip. I happened to be lying on my side. I was scared, but I was getting angry at the same time. I was tired, and I tend to get cranky that way, and I leapt up and threw on all the lights. Again, canvassing the house for someone or something. And again, I found nothing. I laid down for the 3rd time on the floor, nearly delirious with exhaustion. I knew I couldn't sleep now, but what else was I gonna do? I couldn't call anyone, and I couldn't leave because my paper was on the computer, and I had no disk, and it was due at noon. So I laid there, looking at the glowing embers of the fire. I finally started to drift off when I heard a scraping noise coming from the area of the fireplace. I opened my eyes to see a log near the fireplace moving towards me, scraping on the grate. I jumped up, frustrated and angry, but also curious. It was by now 4 o'clock in the morning. I flipped on all the lights and decided to perform an experiment with the log, always being the scientist. I wanted to see how much pressure it took to move the log across the grate and make that scraping sound. I discovered that it took a good deal of pressure. In fact, I had to literally stand on the log and scoot it along to make a replicating sound. I was convinced. I left the lights on and turned on the television. I finally fell asleep, sitting up in the illuminated house. The sight of daylight was welcome. My limited knowledge of ghosts, or too many horror movies, told me that daylight was safe. I finished my paper and gladly left the house. The phone was still out. I turned my paper in and went home. I immediately relayed my story to my mom and called my friend to report the telephone problem. She said that the phone bill had been paid, but that she would call the phone company to come check out the situation the following day. She would be home the day after that. She asked how things were going, and I told her that some strange things had happened, and I would fill her in when she returned. With that, we hung up. I also called my boyfriend and told him the story, which he not only didn't believe, but thought I had lost my mind. Nevertheless, he agreed to stay the rest of the week there with me. The next 2 nights were as uneventful as the first few, no noises or scraping logs. but I was still on edge. My whole concept of reality had been turned on its ear. What I thought didn't exist was now a distinct possibility, and many things I'd never questioned were now questionable. I was spinning. The day my friend would return finally came. I got up and went to class that morning and had returned to the house to gather my things. I was finished packing, and when I sat down at her desk to leave her a note that the phone was still out. As I was writing, I caught a glimpse of movement. It seemed to me to be a feather duster going over the desk area. Of course, nobody else was there, but I got the impression of someone tidying up with a feather duster. I had continued writing when I felt a touch on the top of my head. It was different from the touch I had felt the other night. This one made the hair on my neck literally stand on end. My face was enveloped in warmth, and it was almost soothing. I had had enough of it, though, and I yelled. It abruptly ceased. I finished the note and was just about to leave when the phone rang. The first time in 3 days. It was the phone company. They told me that they had checked the outside connections and had found nothing wrong. It must be inside the house. Yeah, no kidding, I thought. I thanked them and hung up. Bewildered, I picked up the phone again and listened for the dial tone. I heard it. I replaced the receiver and mumbled something about the strangeness of it all. Just then, laughter erupted from the kitchen. Not malicious laughter, nor a chuckle, but a deep, wholehearted laughter of someone who's played a clever joke and thinks it's very funny. My whole body was chilled. I grabbed my belongings and literally ran out of the house, and I never looked back. Later that night, my friend returned home and I called her. I was burning with curiosity. I wanted to know what she knew about this whole matter. I calmly told her the entire story, and she was surprised that I knew things that she had never told me. She proceeded to fill me in on the history of her house and its former inhabitants. The former owners were an African-American couple who built the house in the 30s. They lived there with her brother and his sister. Her brother was a drunk and a prankster, and his sister deeply disapproved of this brother. The brother apparently developed a nightly habit of drinking a pint of whiskey in the woods behind the house. He would then come into the house late at night and after everyone was in bed. He came in through the basement door. He would go upstairs to the bathroom, but not flush the toilet for fear of waking the others. Then he would return to the basement where he slept. It is the brother and the sister of the couple that still reside in the house. Neither of them died there, but they spent 30 years of their lives together in that place. He returned after he died, and it is my speculation that she returned to keep an eye on him. It was her that tried to reassure me at the desk that morning, doing her routine dusting. I am sure of that. I have a totally different outlook since these events took place. I no longer think that things for which there is no hard evidence do not exist. I do believe in ghosts, and I am open to other phenomena for which I have little knowledge of or understanding. Although when my friend called to see if I would house sit for her again, I was hesitant. I said I would, but I would not be spending the night. Bad Night to Go Out, submitted by Zio. I've lived most of my life in a fairly shady neighborhood. I've mentioned that before here a few times, and it's true. Street fights weren't uncommon in my youth, and being a pretty short guy, I got a lot of shit on the regular. I learned quickly growing up the importance of self-defense, and later even got some formal training. However, there are sometimes situations where it just doesn't matter, and this was one of those. I lived in an old house that had a full basement that once functioned by a previous tenant as a separate apartment of sorts. It had its own entrance and exit door, a bathroom, kitchen-like area, 2 huge closets, and a full-size bedroom. As such, it was a great place to have friends over in my teens, especially late at night, because I could just go downstairs and open up the basement door to let people in. This was one of those nights. I had 2 friends over, and it was about 1 a.m. John and Chris, and both of these guys a good bit bigger than me. In fact, John's about 6'2", Chris is about 6 foot even and pretty well built. The point is, while I'm a smaller guy, these two weren't. Also important to note that this was a good few years before it was normal for everyone, let alone teenagers, to be carrying a cell phone everywhere. This was the time of landlines. None of us were hard asses. I had at this point some moderate self-defense training under my belt, but honestly, we were nerds. We got together that night to play Magic the Gathering. Anyway, though not too long after they'd arrived, we got the idea to go wandering around and into the backwoods a few blocks over. Just bored teenagers seeking adventure. We got outside and had walked no more than 10 minutes before we saw a small group of guys slink out from the side of one of the nearby houses. We really only noticed because we noticed the burning cherry of 2 cigarettes. There were 3 guys we noticed as they got a little closer, and instinct told me to start prepping for confrontation. One of the guys simply asked, "What's up tonight, fellas?" But there wasn't friendliness in his voice. I jabbed Chris in the ribs and gave him a look, kind of trying to wordlessly ask if he was ready. At this point, we knew this was bad, and John stated, "Look, we don't want no trouble." I guess that was all it took. The guy on their side in the middle lunged in a few feet between them and threw a sloppy hook at John. It caught him in the eye, though, and he stumbled back. The other 2 dashed out, and one got Chris straight in the nose. He buckled under the blow, and the guy started to pound on him while he was down. The last guy, of course, was in it for me, and only last because I'd been the furthest back as we'd been walking. He came in fast and reeked of alcohol, and we started to fight. I dodged a haymaker and took one straight to the ribs, and then one more wild one to the underside of the chin. It stung, but not because he'd really hit me hard, but rather I bit my tongue on impact and I could taste the blood. It dawned on me that this guy was wasted and honestly wouldn't be that huge of a threat. But the guy on Chris was pummeling him. I needed to get to him. And I couldn't even see John from where I was. The guy and I tussled for a few, and I got about 2 or 3 shots in on his abdomen, and all of a sudden he cried out in surprise and took a dive to the left. John had tackled him. Rather than trying to be a hero and possibly failing, I did the first thing that came to mind. I picked up a fairly large chunk of asphalt and threw it like a baseball at the guy on top of Chris. I aimed for his head, and it connected with his ear. He shot up rigidly, clamping his ear in one hand, and stumbled over Chris as he was trying to get to his feet. I yelled something. I don't even honestly remember what, but Chris was back on his feet and swaying a little. His nose was bleeding badly. I pointed up the street, towards the woods we'd originally planned to go exploring, and Chris and I began to take off. I kind of half-assed grabbed John on the way, as he was still fighting the other guy, and we bolted. The other guy chased after us, and we jumped a low chain-link fence and then bounced into the woods. At least 2 of them had followed a few feet behind us, because we could hear them cussing us out. They kept saying they'd catch up and calling one of us Jeff. We dashed as fast as we could through the woods, which really wasn't that fast, as the ground was uneven, with leaves and tree roots everywhere, and the branches of trees kept whipping at our faces. Chris was moving slower and slower, too. He kept saying his nose was broken, and it came out nasally, like someone suffering from a cold. We ended up circling to the right, somewhere along the way, and just kind of hunkering down behind a pretty thick line of trees and foliage. Chris's nose was pouring blood, and it was certainly broken. We heard rushed footfalls out past our line of trees, maybe 30 feet away, and we heard the guys talking. One was coughing badly. They were still referring to one of us as Jeff, and kept talking about a piece in the glove compartment. This had gone from a shitty, scary situation to a potentially terrifying one. They thought one of us was someone else, and who knows who, and we were talking about what we could only assume was a gun. None of us were armed with anything, and Chris was not doing well. His breathing was ragged, and he was struggling to stifle coughs from all the blood running down the back of his throat. I was trying to scour the ground for a good-sized stone or stick, because I was sure they were going to find us, and I didn't think we'd get away so easily this time. We were lost in the woods as is. Their voices got further away, though, so we felt it might give us the opening to try and get out if we could find the way. So we broke for it, hurrying out from around the tree line and trying to make as little noise as possible. After a while, we heard nothing but our own labored breathing and the general sounds of the woods at night. We slowed down a bit to catch our breath and hopefully find the clearing leading back to the street. After wandering for a bit, we did indeed find the street again and took back to full flight mode, or at least as fast as we could go with Chris in tow. He kept having to spit bloody loogies out as he was running. We got back to his grandmother's house where he stayed, and we helped him inside. Now, he wasn't allowed to hang out with John due to some dumb shit we'd done in the past and gotten the police called on us. He'd ended up being taken home in a police cruiser, and that was that, no more John. For some reason, his grandmother loved me, though. So I took him inside, and he made up a story on the spot that I'd come over to play cards with him, and he'd fallen down the back stairs and smashed his nose on the hand railing. She didn't really seem to buy it, but he insisted, and I excused myself and went out back to meet with John around the corner at a church parking lot we'd often meet up at. We had to go back to my place, and it was still a bit of a walk, and we'd have to pass at least somewhere close to the street where this had all started. We decided John would just stay at my place in the basement until morning, so he didn't have to walk home from there, which was all the way across town. We took off, and while we were paranoid of every approaching car or every strange noise, it was pretty uneventful for the most part. We'd passed that dreaded street and felt pretty confident that we were in the clear when we heard a slow approaching car from behind a few streets over. We started to run across the road to try and jump the fence leading into a random house's backyard, and amazingly enough heard, "There he is! Get that piece of shit!" We jumped the fence as John exclaimed, "You gotta be fucking kidding me!" We bolted as fast as our legs would allow us through that backyard, jumped another fence, and continued that trend through several more yards and over several more fences. We came to a tall privacy fence that we couldn't easily get over, and turned and just dashed through the house's front yard and kept running until we couldn't. We'd stopped fairly close to my house and ducked down into a big sewer or aqueduct type structure. We caught our breath and just jogged back to my backyard and down into the basement and locked the door. That was that. Luckily enough, we'd lost them or they'd given up and hadn't followed us to my house. Needless to say, neither of us slept much that night. We found out the next day that, of course, as we'd pretty much guessed, Chris had indeed suffered a pretty badly broken nose. He had black eyes for almost 2 weeks after that. John had a busted blood vessel in his eye and a sore jaw, and I had a sore rib cage for a few days. But all things considered, it could have been a lot worse. We were pretty hesitant to go out at night for a good while after those events, and it was honestly one of the crazier, though probably not the craziest, nights of my life. The Flag, submitted by Justin W. In 1987, my brother and I were adopted by my grandmother as our parents' drug habits spiraled out of control. My grandmother was raising my aunt and uncle that were teenagers still at this time, so this meant a bigger home for all of us. My grandmother worked 2 jobs just to make sure we had what we needed, so she was never home, and basically my aunt and uncle raised us. We found a beautiful 4-bedroom home with an upstairs loft, and to this day was the best home I've ever lived in. While cleaning out the loft, my uncle and I discovered a folded flag, and we thought, wow, this is cool. We decided to make the loft our rock and roll fortress of solitude. We had several Iron Maiden posters, mixed with Guns N' Roses tapestries, and some Kiss stuff thrown in there. It was very heavy metal, I have to admit. When that flag was hung up, that's when things started happening. We could hear someone or something walking up to our loft at night, and it wasn't unusual for my grandmother to come up and check on us a little after 11 each night. But this would be around 1 or 3 a.m. at night. Months went by, and different things happened, and we could hear military music coming from the basement late at night. My aunt recalled seeing what appeared to be a man in a white tucked shirt and slacks heading towards our loft one day after getting out of the shower. It scared her so bad, she was at the neighbor's when we got off the bus one day. Lights were turning on and turned off by themselves, as well as stuff was moving around without explanation. It got really bad. My aunt and uncle decided to go to Kentucky to visit family over the summer that year, and my grandmother had vacations saved up at both jobs so she could take a week off with us while they visited. Sunday night of that week was the turning point. We had been sleeping in our grandmother's room as we were scared to sleep by ourselves with all this stuff going on. It was 11:34 at night, and I'll never forget it, because Grandma had a digital clock. While staring at it trying to go to bed, I heard what sounded like a poster being ripped in our loft. My little brother said, "Do you hear that?" My grandmother said to be quiet, and then we heard what sounded like someone destroying our loft. Posters being ripped up, cassettes being smashed, albums being broke, the whole 9 yards. Bless my grandmother's heart, she grabbed a bat and headed up the stairs as the sounds were still going on. To our surprise, nothing was touched. There wasn't one thing out of place. Puzzled, we began walking down when we noticed the shadow of a person standing in the hall. We raced down the hall to see it disappear in front of our eyes. My grandmother asked, "Where did that flag come from?" We told her. She said to take it down immediately and throw it away. After that, everything stopped. No more noises. No more nothing. We moved to Kentucky 2 months after this, and fast forward about 3 years, my grandmother got a call from the previous owners asking if we had seen a flag anywhere in the loft. My grandmother told them the story of what we had experienced, and it just so happens that the previous owner's brother was killed in Vietnam, and that flag was his coffin flag. Craigslist Kidnapping, submitted by Anonymous. I don't want my name on this, so please read it, but I'm not naming the towns this happened in or any of the names involved. This is a cautionary tale. I'm a female, 32 years old. I'm 5'5" and only 115 pounds, and I think that's relevant to this story. I was selling my son's old Wii on Craigslist because he didn't want it anymore, and he was saving for a new Xbox. So, up online it went, and I started getting all the lowball offers and such. But one matched my price, so I made my move. Mind you, this was done all via text, and I was going to make arrangements for the person to meet me at a Tim Hortons in my town. I was under the impression that I had been speaking to a guy, but it ended up being a woman in a blue Ford Focus. She said she apologized that her husband couldn't be there at the last minute, so she was taking his place. I thought, no big deal. We made the transaction, both said thanks, and I went through the drive-thru to get an iced coffee. All went well, I thought, and on the drive home I stopped to price out Xboxes at a local store. I saw what I needed and went home and thought that the games were out of my life for a couple of days. But I was wrong. The next night our friends up the street from us were having a party, and my hubby and I went over for some drinks and to hang out. My husband had to get up early the next day and wanted to leave before me, so I said I'd text him when I was leaving, even though it was less than a 3-minute walk away. I had another glass of wine and it got to be around 11:30, so I decided to call it a night. I texted my hubby, talked to my friends for a few more minutes, and then started the short trip home. I saw an odd-looking van, and how typical on our street, that I had never seen before. Oh well, I thought. Probably someone at someone else's house. We have a fairly busy neighborhood. As I was nearing the van, I saw a woman walking towards me under a streetlight, and she looked familiar. As we got closer to one another, I was startled by the noise of the sliding door of the van on the street opening, and as I looked over, the woman walking towards me flew at me and actually tackled me into the van. It happened so fast that I could barely understand what was going on. The door shut and the van took off as another woman in the van flipped me on my stomach and had my hands handcuffed really fast, and it dawned on me what was happening. I started to scream, and a voice yelled, "Shut that bitch up," and someone started wrapping tape over my mouth. A pair of hands was holding my feet, and they taped them together too before letting me go. I looked up screaming, and for the first time saw that one of the women in the van was the woman from Craigslist. The other two women, I have no idea who they were. Now I'm beyond terrified, and I'm kicking out and doing whatever I can to fight, and Craigslist woman grabs my legs, tells me to shut up, and the other woman puts tape over my eyes. Like I said, I'm a pretty small woman, and these two women were much bigger than me. The van kept driving, and I had no idea where we were going, if I was ever going to see my son again, and honestly, I thought I was going to be killed. The driver was making all of these turns, and a voice next to me asked what the hell was going on. The driver said, "I think someone's onto us." They all started freaking out, and the van sped up and slowed down over and over again, and I'm still screaming and shaking every part of my body I can, and suddenly the van came to a stop. The driver just yelled out to run, and they all left the van with me tied up inside, and I heard shouting and a vehicle peel away. The next thing I know, I hear my friend, whose party I was just at, yelling into a phone, and I guess it was to the police. I was screaming my head off, but she kept yelling over to me that the police were telling her to stay away from me unless I was bleeding or hurt. The whole thing was a cluster you-know-what, and it took another 5 minutes for them to show up. I don't think I need to stress what kind of shape I was in, and I'm not ashamed to say I peed myself, I was so scared. The police got there, got me out, and I remember how painful it was having them get the tape off of my head and mouth and hair, and then thinking how stupid of me to care about that. An ambulance came, and I said I just wanted to go home, and by this time I was bawling my head off and shaking. I won't bore you with all the questions and statements, but this is the gist of what happened. The women who kidnapped me didn't realize my friend had come out of her house because after I texted my husband I was coming home, I had left my phone on her kitchen counter. She saw what had happened when they grabbed me, got into her car, and started to follow even though she was pretty drunk. The police decided to overlook that due to the circumstances, and her brother is a state trooper to boot. She had called the police on her phone and chased the van behind a shopping mall, and saw all three get out of the van and jump into another truck and take off. She couldn't get the license plate. The van I was in was stolen, and it turns out the Craigslist woman's phone she had originally contacted me on was what one officer called a burner from Walmart. I guess it was a pay-as-you-go phone long since disconnected. We figured that after we met at Tim Hortons, she must have followed me home and then was stalking me for the right time to grab me. So I got out of it okay. They never found the people who did this, and I've been living in fear ever since. I'm in counseling and therapy, and my hubby is too because it's not easy living with me sometimes. I admit it. I'm super protective of my family and have forbidden social media for my son until he's 16. That might sound harsh, but these people know where I lived, and we don't live there anymore, and I don't want them ever finding me again. This happened 5 years ago, and it's still in my mind like it was last week. The scariest thing that I haven't mentioned, and that no one told me until not too long ago, and the reason I'm writing this to you to get it off my chest, was that the pickup truck that my kidnappers drove off in was missing its tailgate, and when they shot off, a wooden box slid out onto the ground. It was basically a coffin with 2 big hinges, padlocks, and had holes drilled into it on one end. I have no idea what they wanted with me, but I am sure that it doesn't take a genius to know that that box was made for me. I don't like to think about what may have been. To everyone out there, be careful online. I know what happened to me is not typical, but it's proof that it can happen. Thanks, Uncle Josh. I Think It Wanted Me, submitted by King Dave. When I was 14, my dad and older brother were in prison, and me and my mom were homeless and staying with friends in a little camp trailer in their backyard. It was summertime, and we live in Northern California, and for those that don't know it, it gets really hot in the summer around here. The people we stayed with had 7 kids, and they ranged from 6 months to 14 years old, the oldest being one of my best friends since we were little. The house they lived in wasn't that old. It was in pretty good shape, but there was something else that lived there. It was a shadow of a young boy. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe about 5, and it had been seen by more than one person. The first time I personally saw it, the dad of the house stepped into the doorway of his room where me and his wife were sitting on the bed playing Dr. Mario. She said to him, "I thought you put the kids to bed." And he said, "I did." She replied, "Well, then who is that?" I looked over at him, and there was a small shadow next to him in the doorway, and it quickly ran away. We chased it into the kitchen, and it just disappeared. I mean, it was creepy. The story goes deeper than that. One night, it was really hot, too hot to sleep out in the trailer, as there was no electricity out there. So me and my mom decided to sleep in the house. Everyone inside was already sleeping, but they always left the door unlocked for us to come in. I'll explain the layout of the house real fast. When you went into the living room, it opened up into the kitchen and dining room on the other end. There were 2 couches that laid in an L shape, and the one I was laying on, I could see through the kitchen into the dining room where there were some bunk beds that the smaller kids slept on. When I came into the house, the oldest of the small kids, I'll call him TJ, was asleep on the couch, so I scooped him up and laid him down on the bottom bunk, and then went back to the couch. My mom had laid down on the other couch with her head closest to my head, and I closed my eyes and tried to go to sleep. I lay there for about 15 minutes and got an overwhelming urge to open my eyes, and when I did, I was instantly filled with fear. There was the shadow boy, and he was standing over me in a way that seemed like he was going to kiss me or something. He had one knee on the couch next to me, and his arm over the top of me on the back of the couch, and the other arm on the arm of the couch, and was bent over me with his face about 6 inches from mine. It was fairly dark in the room, but there was enough light coming through the windows that I could see around the house, and even being that close, it had no features. It was just shadow. I knew it was something bad. I could just feel it, and it scared the shit out of me in a way that a normal living kid wouldn't be able to scare me. I just said, "TJ, go back to bed." And this thing stood up and began walking into the kitchen towards the bunk beds. But something didn't seem right about it. I just knew it wasn't one of the kids. So I sat up while it was about halfway through the kitchen, and I yelled out, "TJ!" And at that point, this thing stopped as TJ sat up on his bunk bed and said, "What?" Then the thing disappeared. I laid back down, not knowing what to think about what had just happened. But my mom spoke up, and she said, "What the hell was that?" She had seen it too. I said, "I don't know." And without another word, we both got up and went to our trailer. We lived there for about another year, and I never slept in that house again. But my story doesn't end there. Fast forward to about 10 years, and I'm now 24, and the house was abandoned. Part of it burned down, but was still standing, and there were no door or windows. I was at a friend's house and needed to go to another friend's house on the same street about 2 blocks away, and that meant I'd have to walk past the house or walk around 3 blocks to go around it. It was around 11:30 at night, so I said, "Fuck it, I'm not going to go 3 blocks out of my way," and just started walking. I got to the house and glanced up as I was walking by and noticed how bad of shape the place was, and a couple of steps later, I looked up again and saw the shadow boy standing in the broken-out bay window looking at me. I almost pissed myself, so I picked up the pace. I looked up again, and it was standing on the porch now, and I didn't know what to do, so I acted like I didn't see it as I walked. I looked up once more, and it jumped off the porch and started running at me, so I took off like a shot. The street was down a slope, and thank God, as I was running, I started doing that thing where you're running too fast for your legs to keep up, so it was almost like falling. I never looked back until I got to the end of the block under a streetlight, and I stopped and looked back and saw nothing. I turned and continued on my way to my buddy's house, and when I got there, my man asked me, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah. Why?" He said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I smiled and told him, "Yeah, I saw a cop, and he scared me." I don't know what the hell that thing wanted from me, or why it was so interested in me, but I never walked by that place anymore. If I drive past it, I don't look over at it. Since then, the place has been fixed up, and people do live there, and I wonder if they have any experiences like the Shadow Boy like me, but I'll be damned if I ever go up to that house to ask. In the middle of the woods. Growing up, I lived in the middle of the woods. No neighbors for about a mile on each side, and we owned 60 acres of forest, and then a swamp after that. So basically, I lived in the middle of nowhere. One summer, when I was about 14, I was out in the middle of the woods playing with my dog. I was an only child, and both of my parents were out of town, and I kept feeling something hit my elbow. I'd go to throw Max's ball, and the bump would make me throw it almost straight up. Assuming it was just me bumping it on trees or something, I ignored it. But after the 4th or 5th time of it happening, I thought, well, this sucks, I'll just go home. Walking back, I felt uneasy, but I knew I was just freaking myself out because we were alone. About an hour later, Max and I were at home on the couch when the garage door opened and he started barking, just barking and barking. I hopped up to go let in my mom or dad, even though they were home really early, I thought. I peered through the peephole and saw the door was still shut and no one was in the garage. Quieting Max down, I opened the door slowly and called out for my dad. No response at all. So I go to check the door and it's still locked. Okay, sure, weird, but oh well. Max heard it too, so at least I knew I wasn't crazy. About 20 minutes later, I heard the door open again, and this time Max started growling like crazy. I quieted him down again and just assumed it was the wind or something making noise, even though by this point, my heart was racing. I heard footsteps come up the stairs and thought, oh, geez, Dad really is home this time. And I hopped up and ran to the door. It started to jiggle, so I ran faster to help let him in. And then I peeped through the hole again, and even though my hand is loosely around this jiggling handle, there was no one on the other side of the door. Terrified, I went to hide on the couch with all the lights on, and Max was still growling. About an hour after that, I started to feel a little better, even though I was still terrified. And then I heard the door handle jiggling again. This time it was Max jiggling it. He needed to go outside, and the only way outside is through the garage. Fantastic. I literally sprint with him to the kennel, and as I'm standing in there, I decide to ask this thing questions to make myself feel better, because I knew it wouldn't answer me. Thinking about what to ask it, my eyes were drawn to the huge, heavy oak door on the kennel. It was always open because it was too heavy for me to move easily. I said, "Okay, ghost, if you're really here, you'll shut this heavy door." Nothing. I let a minute go by, and still nothing. Max was just sniffing around, and I turned around to yell at him to hurry up, and then from behind me I heard a loud click. I whipped around and saw the giant door had swung shut and latched. Okay, clearly it was just the wind, right? It wasn't really windy, but it was the wind, for sure, it had to be. I proceeded, "Okay, ghost, that was the wind. If you're really real, you'll open the door back up." Nothing. I relaxed a bit and then squatted down with my head on my knees, thinking about how lame I was just sitting there being scared, when I heard click, clack. The door was now wide open. Max was done, so we booked it back into the house, and I locked every other door in the house. For the next 4 hours, I would hear the footsteps on the stairs and the door handle jiggling every few minutes, until finally around 11 p.m. my dad walked in and yelled at me for wasting electricity. I never told him or my mom about it until about 4 months later, when my dad came in from hunting after dark. He looked shaken, and I asked him what was wrong. He said he aimed at 2 deer, but missed both completely, because it felt as if someone was hitting his elbow and making him shoot way above the deer. That's when I told him everything that had happened to me. Creepy Camping by One Post Wonder 95. This is really weird, and I would say a close call. When me and my friends were about 14 or 15, we used to go camping in the woods by our houses. A place called the Punchy that was pretty close to an old church and a graveyard, but far enough to not creep you out. Anyway, we used to take 2 tents and obviously not tell our parents, and we would steal some beer to take with us. This one time in particular, a few girls from school came with us too, so naturally they had lied about where they would be. Anyway, the story goes, we're getting drunk and playing dares, typical teen stuff, sitting around a fire with logs as seats that we had found. It was getting pretty late, and so some people had gone home, but there were still about 4 boys and 3 girls, including myself. It was dark now, probably about 10 p.m., and we had split up into the 2 tents. We were still drinking and generally playing dares that revolved around kissing or telling truths. That's when I heard footsteps coming from the trees outside the tents. I found this weird, and so I stuck my head through the opening, but there was nothing there. And that weirded me out, but I forgot about it after 5 minutes. And then it happened again. I looked. Nothing. I ask if anyone else has noticed, and they say no, so I'm thinking I'm drunk and hearing things. Next thing I hear something brush against the tent. And if you've ever run your finger along a tent, then you know the distinctive sound it makes. You'd recognize that sound anywhere. But the tent had 3 sections, so I couldn't see it move like it wasn't the section we were in that had been touched. At this point, everyone else had noticed this too, and the tent goes silent like you could hear a pin drop. It stayed silent for about 2 minutes, and now if you've ever been in a situation like this, the silence is deafening, and it feels like breaking the silence will have dire consequences. My friend says, "Did you guys hear that?" And we say, "Yeah." "Well, what was it?" I said, a branch or something, because I really didn't know what to say, but I wanted to say something. We stuck our heads out of the tent, and once again, there was nothing there. I was certain someone was out there, though. I just got that gut feeling you get when you know, and I felt like I knew. The tent was in the middle of the woods, but it was inside a clearing, and there was no branches anywhere near close enough to have touched it. There were also no paths, so nobody would have any reason to be nearby. We carried on believing we were going mad, then, out of nowhere, something hit the tent pretty hard. We gasped and backed up to the side of the tent opposite the opening. Not that it would have done any good, because it's just a tent. I realized something is definitely up, and grabbed the bat we used to hit the pegs in. I can't remember what my friend said, but I remember it being something to do with maybe it was our friends that had already left coming back to prank us. And that put me at ease, and I agreed, so me and my friend left the tent laughing and asking our friends to show themselves. But no one did. I found this weird, though, because, it was like the jig was up, and they'd had their scare. I walked over to the next door tent and told my friend who was in there with his girlfriend that the other guys had come back and were pranking us, so don't be shocked if they do anything weird, and that they were just being assholes. He agreed that was likely, and we went back into my tent, and then my friend in his tent next door, which again was only a few yards away, said he was going to take a piss, and if he could borrow my flashlight. I threw it outside the tent and carried on talking to the others, and about a minute later, he popped his head in again and asked for the flashlight again. And I said I just threw it out for him, and he didn't see where it went because he was throwing clothes on while he was inside his tent. We assumed the flashlight had rolled away, so we had a little look and didn't find anything. I found it odd, because there really wasn't anywhere for it to go. The ground was fairly level, and I couldn't see it rolling anywhere. Not to mention, it was bright green and would obviously have stood out. So I lent my friend the lantern we had, and said be quick because we would have no light, and I didn't like the idea of no light considering the way things were getting weird. And I tried to convince him to piss without the lantern, but he wasn't having it. He walked off, and we carried on talking. There was about 6 of us in the tent at this point, as my friend's girlfriend didn't want to be alone while he went for a piss. The next minute, my friend sticks his head back in the tent and says, "Hey, I am not fucking kidding. There's a guy out here." I thought he was fucking around, but panicked because if it was our friends pranking us, surely we would have heard them laughing or something else by now. I stuck my head outside the tent and no one was there, but my friend said he was standing just beyond the tree line, and my friend looked fucking scared, so I took his word for it at this point. The girls were panicking and I didn't really know what to do. We whispered amongst ourselves who should go and asked this guy what he was doing there, or maybe find out our friend was just seeing things. So we agreed 3 of us would go. We took the little bat and walked to the tree line. And sure enough, this guy was just standing there. He had long, messy hair and a beard, but was slim as anything, and he was dressed in camo gear. My friend asked what he was doing, to which he replied in a weird and blank manner, "Walking." We asked why he was walking in the middle of nowhere, and if he had been by our tents, to which he replied, "Them tents ain't yours." Right, this guy was fucking weird, and he was creepy as anything. I mean, just his expression. He then walked off into the woods, and we were deciding if whether or not we should go. We decided we should leave, but it was dark and it would have been hard to find the way with only the lantern. So we decided to sit on it, so we all got into my tent to wait things out. About 2 hours passed, and we couldn't sleep. The next minute, I heard an unzipping noise, and this fucking creeped me out because it was coming from my friend's tent, and everyone was in my tent. Everyone started whispering, "What the fuck is that noise?" And me and my friend stuck our heads out of the tent, and there was nothing there, so we all decided to go and look. We walked over to the tent, and my friend gasped and said, "We need to fucking go." I walked around the other side of the tent, and it had been slashed open corner to corner from behind. And inside the tent was the little green flashlight. Now this made me freak because A, we knew this guy wasn't playing around, he just ruined an expensive tent, and B, he had something sharp to cut the tent fast without it tearing. We walked back over to the other tent, got the girls and most of our stuff, and started walking towards the road through the woods. The most fucked up thing about it is every so often, you could repeatedly hear whispering, rapid whispering and repetitive, but not loud enough to figure out exactly where it was coming from or what it was saying. It felt like an eternity, and this guy could have been anywhere. After about 35 minutes, we got to the road and followed the road home because we didn't want to tell our parents we'd been drinking. Walking home took a good while, and we were looking behind us the entire way. The next day we went back, and the tents were gone. True story. A few weeks later, someone we know from school got chased by a weird guy wielding a knife not far from where we had camped, who had camo clothing on. So he must have been crazy or something, rather than it being like a drug-related thing. And this fucked me up for a good while, and I stopped camping, and the only other times I've been camping is at festivals where there are people. I am by no means a coward, but this guy was obviously nuts, and nuts people do nuts things. The Thing in My Apartment by Incarna. I am both an atheist and a skeptic. When people tell me their personal ghost or demon stories, I don't necessarily believe they're lying. I simply believe that if you strip away embellishment and take into account possible hallucinations, substance abuse, lucid dreams, there's a perfectly rational explanation for whatever it is they experienced. I give this prologue every time I tell this story to illustrate that I am not the "OMG, look at the orb, spirits are everywhere" type of person. Tell me 1 million true ghost stories, and I'll give you 1 million rational explanations. I even have a rational explanation for this experience, but there is still that tiny little voice in the back of my head that asks, what if your rational explanation is wrong? It was fall of 1997. My first college quarter was winding down, making it November or December. I lived in school-sponsored housing at Allegheny Center, Building 7 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was a studio apartment, and I had a roommate named Lance. Lance had dropped out, moved back to Ohio, and I had the place to myself, although a few of his effects remained. His bed, some furniture, the heavy crap that you don't grab when you only got one U-Haul trip after you've loaded your car with all your clothes and other junk. Let me take a detour here to describe Allegheny Center, Building 7. Although it was technically a 10-story apartment building, it was basically a college dorm. It's not super old by any means, but in its time it's seen its share of death. During my 2-year stay, 2 students fell to their deaths, one accidental, one deliberate. But those deaths happened after the event I will describe. Also, Allegheny Center is on Pittsburgh's north side, the oldest part of a very old city. Because of the number of deaths, the building's location, as well as the ample substance abuse that comes with any college dorm, there is no shortage of ghost or demon stories that come from anyone who has ever lived in Allegheny Center. Get 10 college kids sitting around the bong, one-upping each other's creepy experiences, and you'd think Allegheny Center was Cthulhu's personal backyard. I was not into drugs or alcohol during my time there, having long since satisfied my wild child days in high school up in Michigan where I grew up. I was a very serious and dedicated student who was putting his schooling first. I never shared this story with anyone until years later, not because I felt people would not believe me, but because I knew they would believe me, just like they believed all the other crappy supernatural stories that kids tell each other. My experience was not to be lumped into other people's embellishments and drunken hallucinations. My experience was genuine. Okay, back to my story. On some nights before I went to sleep, I would take one of my dumbbells and crack the door to my studio apartment. While I was a dedicated student, I was not above using nonverbal communication to tell whatever female I was interested in at the time that her company was welcome at any hour. The dumbbell in the door was my 19-year-old mind's idea of being smooth. This practice would send a long shaft of yellow hallway light down a short corridor into my studio apartment across my roommate Lance's bed. It would be the only light in an otherwise pitch-black room. I was, and still am, an extremely light sleeper, so I was never worried about someone coming in while I was asleep without me being aware. My bed was on the opposite side of the room, and I was trying to get to sleep when my studio door swung open. The shaft of light from the hallway abruptly widened before narrowing again as the door slammed closed against my dumbbell. A silhouette walked into my room and then sat, sitting upright, feet on the floor, facing me, on my roommate's bed, with the thin shaft of hallway light behind it. And this was odd because a girl would have come over to my bed and made her presence known. So after a moment of strange stillness, I called out, "Carolyn?" Carolyn was a female friend of mine who would not have slipped into bed with me, but might visit me at an odd hour of the night to chat or just hang out. There was no answer, and the shadow just continued to sit on Lance's bed, staring at me in silence. "Lance?" I called out, thinking perhaps Lance had come back to Pittsburgh for some odd reason. He technically still had access to the building until he was completely moved out, and although it would be strange, it was not outside the realm of possibility that he had simply arrived super late. The silhouette answered back in a strange, hollow, completely androgynous voice that absolutely did not belong to Carolyn or Lance. I shot upright and turned on the lamp on my nightstand. I looked back to where the shadow had been sitting, and there was nothing. There was no way anyone could have moved an inch, let alone left the room in the time it took me to take my eyes off of the figure and turn on the lamp, and then back again. Regardless, I sprang out of bed, checked the hallway, removed the dumbbell, and closed my apartment door. I quickly scoured my apartment for person-sized hiding places, of which there was only beneath the beds and in the bathroom. Nothing. Unnerved, I got dressed and decided to leave my apartment and try to find some friends who might be hanging out late somewhere. Until the end of the quarter, I could not get to sleep in that apartment, and I immediately requested to be consolidated into a different apartment when a spot opened up. That may be a lot of lead up to a very brief experience. My rational explanation is that I was having a lucid dream, the hope for unexpected company manifesting unconsciously as the perception of actual company in my pre-REM twilight sleep. I have never experienced a lucid dream before, nor since, but that is the only explanation I can come up with. That, or it's a creepy shadow monster lurking in Allegheny Center who just decided to scare the crap out of a 19-year-old kid. Take my story as you will, but it is absolutely true and devoid of embellishment, diluted only by the erosion of 16 years of memory. I'm not easily frightened, and perhaps because of my inability to be fazed, this experience will always be with me as one of the very few times I have ever been scared in my adult life. Hey gang, hope you enjoyed this volume of True Scary Stories. Couple of quick notes. Next week I'm looking at a live campfire on Thursday night, so stick around for that. And I'm also revamping some things and redesigning the perks of being a patron on my Patreon page. There'll be new levels starting at $1 that will get you access to weekly content before it appears on YouTube, as well as behind-the-scenes videos and blogs. Higher levels will involve merchandise giveaways and more. More to come on that. Thanks for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and check out all of my other content while you're here. If you're having issues with the subscription notices, I can only suggest hitting the bell one more time. Follow me on social media. Links to all of that and my Patreon page are in the description. Until next time, be excellent to each other. And be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.